Okay, quick music disclaimer here. I do not own the rights to this music, which belongs to the rightful owner, who is the intoxicating mind of Dr. Frankenstein. So he made my intro and my outro, and I hope you guys enjoy. Check them out on Spotify and YouTube, and no copyright infringement is intended. Have a good day.
A clear choice of good versus evil, of right versus wrong.
Twisted Tales.
Welcome back to Twisted Tales, folks. Hope everybody's having an awesome week. And it's just been a little busy week here at work, so I figured I'd finish up this episode and give it to you right now. So, we're going to talk about the 1941 Belcher Island murders, and we're going to get right into this. So, the Belcher Islands, just to give you an idea, is an archipelago in the southeast part of Hudson Bay. So, it's kind of like an archipelago is like an island or group, like a kind of like a chain of islands. Now the Belcher Islands, they're spread out almost 3,000 kilometers, and they pretty much belong to the region of Nunavut, Canada, just a little north of the mouth of James Bay and Baffin region. So this land had been first sighted by English navigator Henry Hudson in about 1610. It was actually named for Sir Edward Belcher. Now, I mean, there's a lot of people who, in isolation, whatever have you, they start cults. Or they think of themselves higher up than they actually were. And all this shit pretty much ended terribly. Jim Jones, Manson, David Koresh, just to name a couple. So, this one here is one of the most bizarre and pretty brutal crimes. And it happened in an Inuit community. Now, I mean, the Canadian winters can be extremely harsh, especially in this tale, because it was, like I said, it was back in 1941. And the land was inhabited by an Inuit tribe, and they were just one of the very few around Belcher Islands in northern Canada. So, some went about their day, hunting, fishing, or relaxing in their igloos. And a few were a little bit religious, and they spent countless hours thumbing through Bibles. And a man named Charlie Oyerak, he would have been about 27 years old at the time. Now, this guy was he was the lower status within the community, kind of like a skinny, sickly-looking individual, and he praised God very highly. And one particular night, as winter was getting heavier, a huge meteor shower lit up the sky, and he began to think about, some passages in the book of Matthew. Now, concluding that the world had been coming to an end, and that's what he thought. And like I said prior, this guy was just like a nobody. Nobody respected him. So, I mean, he tried to figure out how to gain notoriety, I would assume, right? So, at one point, I'm just guessing, he decided to make a comeback, as you were. So he started proclaiming to be Jesus. Now, along with another man named Peter Saul, and he was kind of one of the best hunters on the island, I guess, and he started calling himself God. Now, both men spewed their religious shit, and they preached around the little community off and on, spreading the word of the good Lord about a wonderful new life, one without dangerous hunting expeditions, boring fishing trips, hard work, and hunger. So, to start this new world, I'll fire off here. Charlie and them decided it'd be a grand old time to have all the sled dogs killed, because eventually soon, they possessed the art of flying. But by doing this, there was no means of being able to leave the community. Now, community members questioned their ways. A young woman named Sarah also questioned them. And eventually, they deemed her sainted and everything else, right? But that's just how everything went back then. I mean, once you have sway over people, it's hard to justify anything, right? Like, even the people that stood up for themselves, like, were shunned by the ones that believed in God. Now, like, there was a lot of time that hysteria kind of set in. So, I mean, I'm going to jump in and talk about, like, all the horrific crimes and events that took place here. So, they killed the dogs, like, they shot them, and nobody had a way to leave the village, like I said. And also, some started to speak out. So, the first was Sarah Apowak, and she was like a 15-year-old girl. Her brother Alec was one of the disciples. And one night, a meeting took place in a large igloo, and this was on January 26th, so roughly after a week after this guy declared he was Christ, or God, whatever. And Sarah stood up and just straight up told them that they were wrong, like Jesus had not yet come to earth. Now, becoming angry, her brother Alec grabbed her by the hair and hit her across the head with a wooden stick. Now, this wooden stick was usually used for, like, taking the snow off parkas. So witnesses stated later on, someone lit a stove and held Sarah's face close to it, just to see if she was good or evil. And, a lot of people were calling her Satan. As Sarah cried out for mercy, her brother Alec hit her again, this time knocking her unconscious. Others had stepped in, but not to help. A 17-year-old girl named Akinik bludgeoned Sarah's head with the butt of a rifle, and everyone who committed the murder was said to be happy that Satan was gone. One other man had stood up to confront Sarah's killers, a man named Kitoyak. He was a 47-year-old Inuit man. Now, I'm just trying to say these names. If I butcher them, I apologize, but to the best of my ability. He was fed up with the preaching, and these men accused him of being the devil. I mean, you disagree, you're the devil, I guess, right? The men had a little scuffle, but eventually he got free and headed back to his igloo to relax and, blow off some steam. And later on that night, he was just kind of tortured by these guys. Like, by the next morning, he was dead. And the ones that did it were Peter, Sala, and Charles. And there was also a 35-year-old disciple. And he was a newcomer. And he was named Adlakok. So, all these guys pestered this guy. And the three men had tormented him throughout his igloo window. And it was just him in the igloo, like he sat alone. Like, firstly, he was struck with a harpoon, which had been thrown by Sala. Now, followed by 2 bullets that came from the newcomer. And most likely, he was just trying to impress the 2 religious men. Now, over the next little bit, it was about a 2-week period, the killings kind of calmed down, and some families kind of joined another camp of the Inuit on a separate island. And they built some new igloos, and Charles ventured over there and trying to convince people, hey, I'm Jesus, right? Now, among the new tribe next door, there was a well-known hunter named Quarak. He was a 42-year-old Inuit man. Now, along with his son-in-law, his name was Alec Ekpuk. And there was also a handful of women and children on that other side. Now, almost all these newcomers have been overtaken by his preaching, except Ekpuk. And he refused to accept his bullshit. So on February 9th, an argument took place between the 2 men, and Ekpuk had started to walk away from the encounter. Charles declared him the devil, like always, because nobody believed his stupid shit. But, he always had things to say, and everything was his way, right? So he ordered the hunter, Korak, to shoot his son-in-law in the back as he walked away from the confrontation. And he shot him dead. 3 weeks after his murder, Sala's sister, 25-year-old Mina, she was, like, really tight-knit with the religious cult. So she ran around shouting that Jesus was coming and he was going to take the people to heaven. Although she was like a stout little woman, she was incredibly strong. She used this to her advantage as well, kind of like to intimidate people. So she convinced, and most likely out of fear, a family to come out of their igloos onto the cold seawater and to meet their savior. So Mina decided to have everybody strip down and get onto the frozen water, all while her hands were held out to the sky, screaming about Jesus. And it was really windy, like -30 weather. It's not fun. I hate it when that happens here. And she kept her clothes on. She ordered the other ones to strip down, and she also ran around taking off clothes of others. You know, and she also had some of her God followers there. Now, over the course of this shit show, some of the followers started to kind of see their wrongs, and they began giving the children their clothes back. But, it was a little too late. By the time they were bringing them back to the igloos, frostbite set in, and 6 had died, and that included 4 children and 2 adults. Now, the ones they couldn't carry back to safety, they just left on the ice, and they were frozen out there. So, pretty horrible. Like, there was even people that were, like, related to Mina, like her 55-year-old mother, and a 32-year-old sister. And there was actually 4 children. Moses was 13, Alec was 8, Johnny was 7, and Jonasie, she was 6. And Alec was actually Peter Sala's son. Now, all these actions would end up getting back to the RCMP officials, and they would actually venture out to this remote area. Like, it just goes to show how people's minds work. Like, people can be brainwashed into doing things they normally wouldn't. Like, just a bunch of delusional bullshit. And it ended up in a massacre. I mean, even with some supporting this madness, like, I get that some people have their own beliefs and cultures, but, like, it shouldn't have went this far. So, a man named Ernest Riddle, whom had been manager of the Hudson Bay Company outpost on Belcher Islands, he heard about the murders and sent a telegram to the RCMP office in Ottawa. It said, 3 murders committed during an outbreak of religious fanaticism. I hope I said that right. But, by like that time the telegram was sent, Riddle was actually unaware that it was actually 9 murders altogether. Now, Riddle's message had opened up like a shitstorm that would eventually trouble the government and captivate Canadians. So this turned Belcher's Island into like a very cautious place. But Belcher's was just a really remote place, like especially in winter. Like every RCMP aircraft in the country and the pilots were all trying to help with the war effort, because like this is back in the 40s, so the war was like still ongoing. People had to help with that. So there was like less resources. So eventually this caused weeks of delay. RCMP had actually found spare parts for an old Norseman aircraft in Ottawa, and on April 6th, they resurfaced this aircraft, and they left for Moose Factory on the shores of James Bay. So they met up with a local coroner and 2 other RCMP officers to then take off to James Bay on skis and then to the frozen Belcher Islands. Now, about 6 days of touring the Belchers. Everybody was going by dog sled, and they uncovered some of the frozen bodies along the way. They began piecing together some of the events, and the Inuit community had cooperated fully. Like, they didn't try to evade anything or hide any of their crimes. And 3 days later, the police unit left the island with 3 people in tow: Korak, Adlayuk, and Mina. And they left them in custody at the Moose Factory RCMP station, just until the authorities eventually decided to hold a trial. But it wasn't going to be in the courtroom, but on Belcher Island. And this was just to demonstrate to the Inuit community the purpose of good old Canadian justice. Now, it all began August 19th, 1941. After some careful planning, the Judicial Party, plus a prosecutor and a defense lawyer from Ottawa, traveled on the Hudson Bay Company schooner over to the island. They also carried along 2 newspaper reporters from Toronto, Ontario. Now, when they arrived, they noticed about 50 smiling Eskimos, and they all greeted them very happily, like, hey, new people, right? Now, around mid-August, a giant RCMP tent had been erected for the court trial. Most of the Inuit tribe sat on sealskin mats, but most were coughing a lot. It was mostly from the effects of influenza, and some think that it was from the prisoners that were returned to the village after being arrested and taken back for trial. Now, 7 had been accused altogether, the three main characters of the cult: Charlie, Oyerak, Peter Sala, and Mina. And for the tribe folk, Alec, Abawak, Akinik, Adlayak, and Korak. Now, these were, Charlie and his followers and whatnot, right? So Mina had been diagnosed with insanity well before the trial. Like, she was charged with murdering the 6-year-old Jonassy and her family, and she was brought into the courtroom strapped on a stretcher. Alec Apawak and Akinik were jointly charged with the murder of Sarah Apawak. So Peter Sala and Adlayak were charged with the murder of the Inuit and Kitowiak. I really hope I'm saying these names right. And Charlie and Korak were charged with the murder of Alec Edcook. So Peter, Adlayak, Charlie, and Korak were each found guilty of manslaughter. Mina was declared insane and unfit for trial. Peter and Charlie were sentenced to 2 years imprisonment, and Adlayak was 1 year. Now, Mina and Akinik were ordered to be in indefinite custody. Now, the rest of the five were led onto the schooner and taken to Moose Factory. So this is where they lived and worked in exile. It was at the RCMP compound on the shores of James Bay. Now, despite Korak's conviction, he was actually allowed to stay on Belcher's and was ordered to provide a year-round supply of meat because he was just a skilled hunter. So this kind of pleased him, right? But kind of a slap on the wrist, really. But the Inuit prisoners ended up living under guard at Moose Factory for about only a year. Good old Charlie, he actually died in May 1942 after catching tuberculosis. And in the fall of that year, Peter, Adlayak, Akinik, and Mina's behavior kind of returned to normal. They were released from custody and moved up to the west coast to the Great Whale River. But they were on conditions never to return to Belcher's Island. So they pretty much just led a wandering life and lived off the land. And the odd times, like RCMP would check in on them, right? Because they had different outposts up around there now. And many years later, as an old man, Peter Sala returned to Belcher's Island, presumed to live out his last days. And he was still actually like a shunned figure amongst the community. So that's it. He lived out the rest of his days. People died. People got a little bit of justice. And that's all anybody could really ask for. So that's my little twisted tale of the cold parts of Canada. And I love you guys. Thanks for tuning back in. I hope you guys stay safe. And you guys enjoy the rest of your work week. Take care. Thanks for tuning back into Twisted Tales.
Twisted Tales.